Senator Nampijinpa Price, welcome back to 7:30.
Thanks for having me.
Should the youth curfew in Alice Springs be extended?
Look, I think if it's ensuring that the issue of youth crime for the moment is creating some reprieve for the community, then I think it should be reviewed. Once it comes to the end of the time that was first suggested it should be in place, a review should take place as to whether it should be extended. Of course, it's only really a short-term measure, and there are some long-term measures that need to be put in place and need to be considered for our youth in Alice Springs. And you know, broadly for the Northern Territory, you know, this is an issue that I think progressed from Alice Springs and is certainly occurring right throughout the Territory in terms of youth crime ever since it sort of began in Alice Springs.
Can I just ask you a question about that? Because I think the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory has said she's open to extending youth curfews to other towns in the Territory. Would you support that?
Yeah, look, again, I think the Chief Minister really needs to look at the crux of the issue and why we're faced with the issues that we've got at the moment. It's one thing to say, look, we're just going to slap the whole of the Northern Territory with youth curfews, but that, again, that's not a long-term measure. And, you know, there are youth in our communities that need to have a life as well, that aren't committing crime. You know, there are those who feel like they are being punished for the wrongful behaviour of others. We don't want to become a lockdown territory inevitably. So yeah, the long-term solutions need to come into place sooner rather than later.
Now, you've argued, I think, that young people who break the curfew should be detained. Where and how should they be detained?
Well, I don't know if I've argued that young people who break the curfew should be detained, but we need to certainly look at a better situation than what we do have. I mean, the current situation is that, well, young people before the youth curfew came into place would be removed from the streets, or, you know, they would steal a car, they would be picked up by police and returned to a responsible adult. Now, but we don't know what actually defines a responsible adult. And in many circumstances, those young people would be returned to where, I guess, a responsible adult resides, and then would head straight back out onto the streets, or be out the next day. The following day, I know of circumstances where they've basically stolen the same vehicle over a number of consecutive nights. So, you know, this has occurred largely because of the fact that Indigenous children in the Northern Territory aren't necessarily removed from dysfunctional circumstances in terms of trying to improve their lives from the get-go when, you know, there's been reports made about their care. And this is an ongoing issue, one that I've talked about for a long time, that we shouldn't be treating Indigenous children any different to other children if they are living in dysfunctional circumstances.
Let me ask you a question about that. I mean, are you saying that dysfunctional families cannot be repaired, made functional with much higher levels of support? Look,
I think priority is ensuring that the human rights of children is upheld first and foremost. The family, the situation for the family, I think is a second priority. But in the immediate term, if a child is experiencing neglect, abuse, sexual abuse, then that child's safety and human rights needs to be upheld, and yes, should be removed from a dysfunctional circumstances if their human rights aren't being upheld in those circumstances. And unfortunately, that hasn't been happening for Indigenous kids because of course, the stigma of the stolen generation previous policy. But we're at a stage now, this is a result, the youth crime is a result of these kids not having that level of intervention early in their lives to ensure that they were growing up in safe environments where their needs are being met and where their human rights are being upheld.
I'll come to the stolen generations in a moment, but doesn't the real, albeit very expensive, solution to these people's lives, these young people's lives, lie in major investment to build up their home communities?
One of those investments was something that I've called for a number of years now, which is to support, where children can't be put into a foster arrangement with carers that can uphold their human rights. Well, then we have schools like the Yipirinya School who are basically trying to provide for these kids who are our most marginalised with elders within the school itself who are prepared to be the responsible adults in their lives. If we were able to invest in somewhere like Yipirinya to have a facility that provides for their education, the upholding of their human rights and meeting their needs, then that is something that I've called certainly the Albanese government to invest in some time ago, and they're still waiting. To
be clear, the federal government just announced $18 million in capital works to extend boarding school facilities in Central Australia. Isn't that exactly the kind of solution that you're seeking? Because that would likely include Yipirinya.
Well, we've yet to see who is included in that and whether Yipirinya is included in that. I would hope to think that it would be included in that, and that full investment would be prioritised, particularly for that school, because they have been calling for this investment for some time, and we might not have seen as much of the crime on our streets if it was invested in earlier. We also know that some of that crime correlates with some of the sexual abuse that some of those children have experienced, and as a result of that, they have acted out.
Let me just ask you this, because you raised the issue of the stolen generation, and in your argument that in fact, the stigma of the stolen generation, in your view, is working against good policy. But aren't the lessons of the stolen generation that long-term separation of children from their families had devastating consequences?
Oh, look, this is a completely separate issue, because obviously long-term inclusion in dysfunctional circumstances, exposure to domestic violence, sexual abuse, any child who doesn't get a good education is fast-tracked into incarceration. That is what is playing out now as a result of these children not being removed and treated like equal Australian citizens who deserve their human rights upheld. It's a different set of circumstances to what's happened previously.
You would likely be the Indigenous Affairs Minister in a coalition government. What level of investment would you be arguing for these communities?
What I've been calling for is for an audit of where these millions of dollars are going. We know that there are some organisations doing an incredible job and are producing outcomes, but we also know that there are many that are not bringing about the outcomes that are required for our most marginalised. And so my first port of call, if we can't get an audit up and running within this term of the Albanese government, then we would be taking that to the next federal election as an election promise to have that audit, because we need to invest where we know it's going to be effective, and ultimately everybody's responsible, not just government who throws money at a situation, but those that receive the money should be producing the outcomes.
Senator Nampijinpa Price, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.